microphone? Yes, thank you. Good. All right, so let's see if my voice will last another 30 minutes or whatever. What I've been trying to do in these talks, and some of you have been here the whole time, you get a gold star actually at the end of the day, or a pay raise. Sorry. Okay. I'm trying to help you out. You too. Okay. Just trying to help us understand Old Testament social ethics. The first lecture was talking about some decisions we have to make about the Bible. Is this the Word of God? What does that mean? How do we get at it? How do we relate Old Testament ethics to ethics in general? Let's say you get to philosophical ethics and social sciences and all these kinds of other things. So the first one was kind of an orientation to the discipline of Old Testament social ethics, which is pretty complex, which is one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating, because I have an excuse to do everything because of Old Testament social ethics. The second one, which we just did, was trying to set up the theological reasons why we even talk about ethics. And so we talked about creation, the nature of God who will call us to an ethical life. What does it mean to be human? You see, because we're the ones, the humans are the ones that actually do ethics. So what does that mean? Why do we need to do ethics as part of what it means to be human? And then we talked about the fall. This is the context into which we are called to do ethics. And once we begin to unpack the Bible and its description of human life, we begin to see just how dark the world is. There's wonderful things in creation. God made it good, even though now that the goodness has fallen, but it's still good in many ways. Humans are made in the image of God, so, we're all kind of good in a sense, but we're fallen as well. And what we begin to see in the biblical account and in life is that life can be very dark. Now, in the ancient world, one of the things that's different for us in this country, in the ancient world, for instance, you didn't have pesticides and things like this, so issues of locusts, which would be devastating to the agrarian world, which was ancient Israel, would be terrible. We think probably about half the children died before age 5 from various diseases or from hunger. War was a fact of life. For us, it's something strange. It's something over there somewhere. But for them, it was what they lived. The armies, later on, the monarchy were professional armies, but they always had an element of what we would have called militia, of being called up. This may help explain why in the Old Testament you have so much about widows, because of warfare, let alone natural death. Most people would live maybe into their 30s and early 40s, and that was the life expectancy. A very hard life. And so it was dark in its own kind of way, but our world in itself is very, very dark. We can anesthetize it in this country because we can live comfortably. We can talk about this in this nice building, in this historic campus. Then we're going to break for lunch, which I'm sure will be just scintillating. Yes? You're supposed to say amen. That's what you're supposed to say. Wesleyan holiness, you say, yes, amen. And then we'll come back and we'll have another hour, and then maybe some Q&A, and then I'll go home, I'll go back to Wheaton. Kind of a nice kind of day. So we kind of anesthetize it, don't we? But when she's talking about ethics, now you're talking about really stuff on the ground. Whether you're talking, women's shelters or poverty or after school tutoring or, life in terms of abortion and not, immigration, issues of war. I mean, we could just go on and on and on. And that's where these kind of discussions need to land eventually. We can't afford just to have armchair ethicists with legislation. All these different kinds of things come into play with this particular topic, and so that's been a learning experience for me. So that's what we did last time, just the darkness in which we live. Even as we're made in the image of God, we live in a very dark world. So when we go to the Old Testament narrative, how does this work itself out? And so what I want to do in this 45 minutes or so is talk about relating ethics to the mission of God. And what we will be doing is we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 12 and working from there. Coffee, that's one of the blessings. That is good, and God said so. Okay. Now, I've got to work this, don't I? So, the breadth of divine concern. When we get to chapter 12, we have to set chapter 12 within the context of the narrative. And what we have in the narrative is a series of contrary things. So we have the enmity with the serpent in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where there'll be this tension, you see, between the woman and her seed and the serpent, and it will play itself out in history. We have tension between the genders, chapter 3, verse 16, and that is the stuff of life. We'll have alienation from the ground, and the ground we were supposed to till and enjoy its fruits. Now what we experience is the sweat of our brow and the thorns on the plants. We're separated from God. We're alienated from Him. We're taken out of the garden, and the angels guard the entrance. We cannot go back. We see the alienation from God when Cain kills Abel and is unrepentant and is sent wandering. We see the alienation from God where it says, and the whole world was full of violence, and all the thoughts of humanity were evil, it tells us. And so now what you have is a judgment, the judgment of the flood. And then in chapter 9, when you have kind of the retelling of the story, chapter 9, they come out of the ark, builds an altar, that's all very good. And in chapter 9, verses 1 and following, you find repetition word for word out of Genesis chapter 1, but with some small changes. Now in chapter 9, for instance, in verses 5 and 6, we'll talk about if a person's blood is shed, see, that person will also have his blood shed. Now what you're seeing is, whereas in the earlier narrative, death by violence was anticipated and it happened, now it is a given. Humans will begin killing each other. Blood will be shed. This is a fact of human existence. And now what you find in chapter 9, verse 6 is the threat of violence in return. Somehow control our violence. Now, you will see this played out in modern discussions with something like this. Is the death penalty a deterrent or not? Okay, you're hearing Genesis. If you shed blood, then your blood will be shed. How do we work all of that into the equation of the death penalty and the issues of human violence? Then what you find is this rebellious human civilization. I didn't mention this last time, and I should have. In chapter 4, at the end, before Lamech boasts about how many people he will kill, it talks about how his children are the founders of human civilization. They work the ground, they do the metal, and they do the arts. Now, why that is important is that what you're beginning to see is all these accomplishments of human civilization, chapter 4, beginning in verse 17, are grounded in the descendants of Cain. And actually, Cain is the one who builds the first city. See, the founder of this great human achievement, the city, is Cain. And now you're beginning to hear, you see how the Bible will understand all these things. All the potential of humanity tinged and permeated in a cancerous way with violence. And then you get the litany of death that I was talking to you about in chapter 5. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. Everyone is dying. And then what you have is perversion. And we're not really sure what's going on in chapter 6. But you have the sons of God looking upon the women of men. What does that mean? And then you have another passage, we're not sure what it means, where one of Noah's sons will uncover his nakedness. What does that mean? But at the very least, it's something perverse. So you have all of this backdrop, grounded in human arrogance, which will culminate in chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. Now, in this narrative, what you have had also have been glimpses, or I would call them moments of divine grace. And let me just give you some of these. In chapter 3, verse 15, it talks about the seed of the woman overcoming. Some will call this the proto-evangelium, chapter 3, verse 15. That's a word of hope. Chapter 3, verse 20, even though it's all about death, when he gives the woman a name, he relates her name to life. Chapter 3, verse 20. And of course, now she will bear children with God's help, even though she will bear children with pain. One of the things that's amazing about women is childbirth. But one of the amazing things about being a man is that you don't have to go through that. I remember, I've got to tell you this story. We're in Costa Rica, and our first son is born in Costa Rica, in San Jose. And we did the Lamaze thing, where you do the breathing classes, And for the male, it's a really awkward thing, You're staying and you practice the breathing and all stuff. Okay. Have any of you done that? Okay, all right. I don't know if they do that anymore. But anyway, so then what happened was we had been going to this maternity hospital. And my wife, everything begins, right at midnight, because babies it's always like at midnight, right? And why? I don't know. So we're like, oh, is this it? And I don't know. And within half an hour, the contractions are every 2 minutes. So we need to move quickly. So we get to the hospital, and I go to the hospital door, and the lights are out, and the door's locked. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what? And, I just started beating on the door. What else? And so finally there's a guard who's asleep, and he wakes up, and he opens the door, and there's some nurses in the back. Just so happened that our doctor was out of the country, but they had given us the name of somebody else. I mean, it gets worse. And so they take my wife away. And we were there for language school. She didn't know Spanish, and so we were there. And of course, any Spanish that she had known up to that point was just totally gone. Right? And so they take her away. And I'm standing there, and then I hear my wife yell at me, "You better get back here." And so I start kind of, going, and they said, no. Back then, men can't do this, right? And so I said, I need to translate for my wife. They said, okay. So, of course, I'm tall. And so they give me the green things, right? And of course, it's like here. And then the little booty doesn't even cover my shoe. And then, okay, so I go in. And so from when it starts with my wife until the birth of our son, it's 2 hours. Okay. So anyway, so I go into the room and I say, okay, now let's practice our breathing. And she goes, oh, just shut up. And she's holding my hand and like piercing. I had the stigmata, on my hands. the pain of childbirth. Even it's a glorious time. Grace. And then, of course, God covers their sin or their bodies in chapter 3. In chapter 4, verse 1, she gives birth with divine help. And God even protects Cain. He gives him a mark, you see, that protects him. So, I mean, there's grace. You see these moments of grace. In chapter 4, verse 25 and 26, there's another son that's born that replaces Abel. And this is Seth. And it says, and the people of the earth began to call on the name of God. In chapter 5, when you get that refrain of death, there was Enoch, who does not die, and he's taken into heaven. You see, you get these moments, and then you have, Noah. Noach is his name. And it's related to a verb which means rest. And if you're jotting down notes, some of you are, if you look at 5:29, it talks about how he is going to give them some kind of respite, some kind of rest from the curse of the ground. And all that seems very great, and he does what he's supposed to, and he builds this ark, and he goes through the storm and the flood, and it's all amazing. And then he comes out, and then he plants a vineyard, and then he gets drunk. And he's passed out. Oh, the great hope of the world. Where do we go from here? This will take us into chapter 12. Chapter 12. I need to press buttons here. Okay. I want to begin with some exegesis of the passage. Because as you begin reading the passage, you begin to see that it is very self-consciously picking up vocabulary from earlier passages, because what you're going to see how God responds. Now, what he says to them is that he will make them into a great nation. He will give them a name. But if you know the Babel story, they had said, let us build a tower that reaches to the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. The human attempt toward greatness is built out of rebellion and arrogance. Now what you have is the naming and the greatness coming from a very different kind of place. Now, what we find is in chapter 11, the greatness and the name is based on their attempt to reach the heavens. But now what we find in chapter 12 is that the greatness comes as they bless the world. The greatness and the name that they receive comes through the service to the world, not through their arrogance to reach to the heavens. And what's amazing is how this works. And depends on your English translation. So what kind of translation do you all use normally? NRSV. Okay, some people use NIV, and there's all kinds of them. So there's a word in chapter 12, verse 3. And different translations will translate it differently. Some will translate it as families, or clans, or peoples. So I'm not sure what the NRSV does in 12:3 about blessing all the, what do you have? All the others, that's all it says? The NRSV, chapter 12, verse 3? Oh, that's interesting. Families, okay. It depends. And each of those actually is okay, because it's a bit of a fluid word, but mishpachot is the plural form. Mishpacha, mishpachot in the plural. Now, where you find that word earlier is in chapter 10. When it goes by each of the three sons of Noah in chapter 10. These are the sons of Shem, these are the sons of Japheth, all this. And it says, according to their, again, I don't know what the NRSV has, according to their clans or families or tribes, the word is mishpachot, the same word. So you see it in chapter 10, verse 5, verse 20, and then verse 31, the same word. Mishpachot, mishpachot, mishpachot. But if you remember in the narrative, all the nations of the world, all the nations in chapter 10 are coming from Babel. Remember we talked about that last time. That means all the mishpachot of the world come from Babel. And then what he says in chapter 12, verse 3, and all the nations, or all the mishpachot, will be blessed through you. See, all the mishpachot of the world are born in rebellion against God, and they are the ones that are to be blessed by his people. Okay? The mishpachot, the children of Babel, the mishpachot, the ones we serve. The very peoples who live in rebellion against God, that's whom we are called. And what you begin to see then is the people of God are born to be a blessing. Now, watch theologically. If all the mishpachot of the world in the narrative are born at Babel, how can God choose one of them to be his people? And he doesn't. He doesn't choose a nation. He creates one. He creates another people. Not a people born at Babel. Even though, interestingly, Abram is from Ur in the region of Babylon. But he doesn't choose one of the nations of the world. He chooses a man, and he begins to build a people, to serve as a blessing, the mishpachot of the world. The very reason for our existence is mission. Interesting. That's why we're here. We are created, if I can begin to build this out a bit, we are created for ethics and witness. That's why we're here. That's the reason for our existence. And when we call people to faith, sometimes we try to water the gospel down. Come to Jesus, everything will be okay. That doesn't really work. Because things with Jesus sometimes are fine, and sometimes it's just being human. And Christians get sick, and Christians die. We're all humans. We call people from darkness into light. We offer them a cross and a life of service. That's the gospel. And that has an ethical dimension to it that is inescapable. Now, when you look at the narrative in chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, what you will find are two imperatives. The first imperative is to go, to leave your country. And then you get three promises. I'll make you into a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name great. Those are the three promises. Again, I will make you into a great nation, I will make your name great. You get the echoes of Babel. An imperative and three blessings. What you have in the grammar is another imperative. After, and I will make your name great, literally in the Hebrew text it says, be a blessing. Now that imperative can be taken one of two ways, and they both work syntactically. You can understand it as, so that you will be a blessing, okay? Or you can understand it as a separate imperative, be a blessing. And it's followed by three promises as well. It's followed by, I will bless those who bless you, whoever curses you I will curse, and all the mishpachot on the earth will be blessed through you. So you have an imperative, three promises, an imperative, three promises. But the order is important. The first imperative is to go and to leave and to go to the land where he's going to take them. And then he says, I will bless you. Make you a great nation and a great name. And then be a blessing, or so that you be a blessing, and then some more. The last of which is, and you'll be a blessing to the nations, or the mishpahot of the earth. Do you see the sequence? You will receive blessing. Therefore, be a blessing. It is because we have been blessed that we have been made into a people that we now can be a blessing. This is the mission of the people of God, to be a blessing to the world. It's the reason for our existence. Go to the place, I tell you, and I promise you these things. A great nation, a great seed, a great name, I will bless you. Okay, now you be a blessing. What follows in the three promises is interesting as well. Because if you look carefully, look at your translation. Again, I don't know what the NRSV has. I have the NIV in front of me, but it says this: whoever curses you, I will curse. But I will bless those who bless you. Now look at the number. I will bless those and whoever curses. In the Hebrew, I will bless those is plural. I will bless. The expectation is, as we fulfill our mandate, there will be more people who will bless us than curse us. Whosoever curses. That's in the singular in the Hebrew. The expectation is plural response, positive. We should expect to be cursed. We should expect that. But smaller number. Whosoever. And if you would even be more technical in the Hebrew, when it says whosoever curses you, it's the verb kalal, which is, if I know Gilberto teaches Hebrew, the kal stem in Hebrew is the simple stem. Okay? So it's from kalal. Whosoever, makes you minimal, who minimizes you. Menosprecia, as we would say in Spanish. The one who minimizes you, who makes you small. Isn't that what people do to Christians? They push us aside, they demean us. We should expect this. In fact, it's in Genesis 12. We should expect people to demean us. And when they do, God will curse them. Interesting, isn't it? I will bless those, plural, who will bless you. And whoever demeans you, I will curse them. But you be a blessing, even to them, even to the mishpachot of the earth. Now, that raises the question. I need to be doing this, don't I? What does it mean to bless or to be a blessing? And as I mentioned in the first, I think it was in the first, maybe it was in last time, I'm not sure. It's one of these Christian words that no one knows what it means. So, be a blessing. What does that mean? Oh, just be a blessing. Okay, but it's a Christian word that no one knows what it means. What does it mean? Well, if you let Genesis define its own words, you find blessing and bless in the first two chapters of Genesis. He blesses the animals and tells them to multiply. He blesses humanity and tells humanity to multiply. Then he blesses the seventh day. And what you begin to see in the narrative in Genesis 1 and 2 is that blessing is related, first of all, to physical life, to children, to offspring, the fruit of the ground. Blessing is physical, material. But he also blesses the seventh day. Blessing has a spiritual dimension to it. So the blessing of God is full-orbed. It's multidimensional. It's physical things, and it's spiritual things. And if you begin to look at the narrative of Genesis, you see all of these things happening. So the patriarchs are blessed. What does that mean? Well, children, sheep, flocks, water. Genesis 26. Abimelech can't find water. Isaac does. Finds wells. The blessing of water. So you have all these kind of physical things going on. The blessing. And we'll see in just a moment how people respond to this, because you find in the narrative of Genesis that people actually will respond to this. But it's also spiritual. So what you find in Genesis is that they build altars. They call the name of the Lord. They will verbally testify. This comes from the hand of Yahweh. They'll verbally testify to their faith. And then you see Abraham praying for Sodom and Gomorrah to spare the judgment of God. You're seeing all kinds of blessing. And one of the most powerful ones is when you go to the end of Genesis. And Jacob, the old man. Joseph, if you remember, is in the palace, and the whole family, the whole clan comes. Jacob and all the sons, the brothers, and their families. And if you remember in the narrative, it tells us that the Egyptians despised shepherds. What was Jacob? He was a Bedouin. And then what you find is that Joseph will present his father to Pharaoh, the immigrant. He's not even an Egyptian. Presenting his Bedouin father to the most powerful man on the earth, whose culture despised everything his father stood for. What were his emotions? Was he embarrassed? Don't know. What you see is the old man walks over to Pharaoh and he blesses him. Is that an amazing story? But it's the story of the people of God. An insignificant Bedouin blessing the most powerful man on the planet. Blessing is spiritual, but it's also physical. Now, go back. What you find then is people respond. And some of you have Bibles, which is a good thing, I think, at a seminary. And let me go to a couple of passages. In Genesis 26, this issue of the wells, if you were to go to verse 28 and 29, there's been a problem with the shepherds of Isaac and the shepherds of Abimelech, and they finally come to an agreement. They make a covenant, it says. And what Abimelech says is fascinating, because he says this: we now see that you are blessed by Yahweh. They see the blessing of water. But they also know the giver of the blessing. We see that you are blessed by Yahweh, because they have seen Isaac's faith and they have heard his testimony, and they respond. I will bless those who bless you. Now, a fascinating narrative is a bit later with Melchizedek. It's actually earlier in chapter 14. If you remember the scene, Abram has to go and rescue his nephew Lot. And when it all is done, and Melchizedek, the high priest of the Most High, brings out bread and wine, I'm in verse 18. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gives him a tithe. But there's one more word coming. So what you have is this high priest of the Most High God blessing Abram. Abram returns with a tithe, so he's blessing him materially. And then you have to watch. Beginning in verse 21. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have raised my hand to the Lord," or Yahweh, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Now, if you were to look carefully at your text, Melchizedek had just said, "I bless you by the God Most High." Abram adds, Yahweh, the God Most High. He gives the Most High God a name. Okay. It's kind of like Paul. Okay. You worship a God you do not know. Let me tell you about him. It's Abram in chapter 14. You are a priest of the Most High God. His name is Yahweh. So what you see them doing is blessing. Blessing materially and blessing spiritually. But as you work through the narrative, what you also begin to see, and this is the last point that I want to work on in the time I have left, is that it's a pilgrimage of faith and sometimes of terrible disaster. Because they're human. And sometimes the lack of faith is abysmal. After he's given the mission in chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, and they respond by building altars, and they move into Canaan. Oh, very good. But then you find in chapter 12 that there's a famine in the land, and they begin to move to Egypt. Do you remember how the story goes? They're getting close. We think the Egyptians, well, we know they did, had a series of forts on their eastern frontier. Egypt was always the breadbasket of the ancient world, so they're always dealing with people coming in for food. This is their history. So they built a series of forts, some checkpoints on the eastern frontier. So it's probably, I would think, that as Abram and Sarai are getting close to one of these checkpoints, they've got to get across. And he says to her, he says, if they ask you, tell them that you're my wife, my sister, not my wife. Now, there's some truth. They were related, actually. It tells us this later, chapter 20. But what you see him doing is trying to save his own neck. You see this in immigrant stories where the woman takes on all this risk. She's literally putting her body at risk so that they can eat. What's the choice? To lie to get across the border? Does that ring a bell? To survive? Or go back into the desert and die? I mean, those are the options. And so the great father of the faith and his wife and Lot, they lie to get across the border, as immigrants do. And while they're in Egypt, they pick up Hagar. That's going to take them a whole another way. The most tragic story is the rape of Dinah, chapter 34. The perversion of it all. Her brothers have the men of Shechem circumcise themselves, the very sign of the covenant, to incapacitate them so they can kill them. To the sign of the covenant. Perversion of the very essence of who they were supposed to be. Those are the low points. And there's others of lying and cheating, deceit. It's our story, isn't it? If we're honest. But then you have these high points. In chapter 15, when Abram is just wondering, is this ever going to happen, the child? And God takes him out and says, look at the stars of the sky. That's how many descendants you will have. And he believes. Verse 6. And it was counted to him as righteousness. You've heard that verse. High point. But the high point of Abraham's life is in chapter 22. Chapter 22. And if you read it carefully, you begin to see the power of the narrative. God says to him, take your son, your only son. Your only son. And he goes. And he goes. And they reach the place, and the son says, Father, he says, we have the wood, but where's the animal for the sacrifice? And you know how it goes. God will provide. What is Abraham thinking once he's put his son on that altar? How will God provide? Is it too late? We're just about there, aren't we? And he does. But I want you to follow the narrative. If you were to go to chapter 22 and begin reading in verse 15. The angel of the Lord, or Yahweh, called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and he said, I swear by myself, declares Yahweh, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. He says it several times in the narrative. I will surely bless you and make your descendants great, or as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And listen to what he says. And through your offspring, all the nations on the earth will be blessed. You hear it? Genesis 12. But here comes he. Because you obeyed me. And what we begin to see is that we are called to mission. The mission is permeated with ethical stuff of all kinds. In his case, of agricultural stuff and family stuff and political stuff. But they're humans, they're fallen, they're rebellious, they're deceitful, they're arrogant. And through it all, he kind of uses them. And we fulfill our mission to be a blessing when we obey him. Now you begin to see that blessing is tied to obedience. And if the blessing is connected to ethics, which I think it is, this is part of our obedience, is to live ethical lives with our families, right? At work, creation, politics. This is what it means to be the people of God. A people of blessing. And that's why we're here. That's the only reason we're here. When we call people to the gospel, we're calling them to a life of sacrificial service. That is who we are to be. We will find our life, Jesus says, as we give it away. That's where we find life. It's one of the things about being a dad. I have grown sons now. They're men, they're families. Well, one of them they don't have any children yet. We're working on that one. The other one has given us 3 grandchildren. But one of the things about children is that you're forced to get out of yourself. It's the late nights. It's the poopy diapers. It's helping with the homework. It's crying with them. It's laughing with them. You find out who you are as a parent. That's who you really are. You get exposed. And one of the things I've learned, I have one son who's 36, another one's 34. I never quit being a dad, but my role changes. They ask me different things, and now I'm, my grandkids, they call me Ito for abuelito. They call me Ito. Or Ito. Ito, not Ito. No. It is as you give yourself away as a parent, as a husband, and now as a grandfather, that I learn who I really am. It exposes me in the darkness of my soul. It's a pilgrimage of faith, and of ups and downs and, detours, but moving forward. So, we've gotten at least once of those one of those calls. So time's up. Is that what? No. Okay. In the first hour, we talked about just some basic decisions and perspectives to even do Old Testament social ethics. In the second hour, we talked about this is why we have to do it. We live in a fallen world. And now, what I've tried to do in this lecture is talk about how ethics is intrinsic to being the people of God. Part of our mission to be a blessing to the world. Now, what I'd like to do in the fourth lecture this afternoon after lunch, which will be scintillating, amen, okay, is talk about the prophets. And the prophets are amazing. And it's one of the most avoided parts of Scripture, except at Christmas time, because we know our Jesus verses. But there's a lot there. So we'll be looking at the prophets, and I'll look at Amos in particular. So we have about 2 minutes, I think. If there are any questions, fine. If not, okay.
Yes, I believe in the continuity of the people of God as you were involved in. I'm listening to hear what you're reading the Hebrews. I wonder, listen to say that reading
yeah, here's the thing. I'm going to get some technical language, and I don't know who you are, so excuse the technical language, and it may not even be technical for you, so I just don't know. So you have what's called kind of Christocentric readings. This would be the more the flat that you were talking about, where you read the Old Testament from the New. I don't do that. I look at Christotelic. It's pointing to Messiah. So Jesus becomes the fulfillment and the embodiment of all these things. I think it's important to do it that way so I can hear the Old Testament properly. So I find fulfillment in the New Testament in the life and person of Jesus, but I'm not going to read back. I'm not going to impose. So I don't see it flat. I see this as a trajectory forward. But it's progressive. Yeah, and I think what happens, and I see it in Old Testament studies, there's a resurgence of this kind of Christocentric reading, going back to the church fathers, and in Old Testament studies you see, going back to the church fathers, and what you're getting are these really Christo-focused readings, which has historical place in the church. I just don't read it that way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Imply that many translate that spiritual fulfillment, you're seeing in terms of land and water and resources, children. I can see all that coming together. Blessing.
Yeah, but I also see it as very spiritual because they do this in the name of Yahweh. So even when Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," okay, that comes at a cost. That's real conflict. Blessed are those who suffer for righteousness' sake. Now we're talking persecution. I mean, there is a reality, earthiness about the Beatitudes that we will tend to avoid. You know, we'll go the happy route, you know, on the Hebrew Ashrei. But I think there's more there. Yeah, thank you. You had a question.
Is going back to your talk about Abraham and the chosen.
Right.
Do you agree or disagree with the middleist notion that Israel, that modern day state of Israel?
No, I wouldn't. I would just by way of, I don't agree with that, and I'll explain what I do believe. I would just avoid labels like fundamentalist, just because sometimes that just creates divisions we don't need. So I would just say, it's a point of view I don't agree with. Because I find fundamentalists on the left and the right, actually. You find some critical scholars who are the most fundamentalists you can ever meet. Narrow and bigoted from the left. I mean, so I just try to avoid the word. You know, what I would do is I would go back to the prophets, because the prophets make a very clear distinction between the remnant, who are the believer, what we would call believers, and faithful ones, and the nation state. I mean, they're very clear about the difference. And so, even if one believes that there is a future for the people of the Jewish people, that should never be confused with the state. You know, so, and that's very easy to show in the prophets. I mean, the prophets will proclaim the end of the state, even as they preach the hope of a remnant. They make a clear distinction. So I would say, no, I don't see that as a one-to-one.
I want to ask a question.
Yeah?
I was intrigued by your reading of Sarah saving Abraham's scheme. They're going into Egypt.
Yeah.
And you have actually mentioned several times already mystery of motherhood, right? And the wonder, which is the feminine capacity to give life. I teach one of my classes online, so students have to responses. And we actually were talking about these Genesis 2, I think it was last. One of my students posted, these would only have been a man of taking the son and here killing him. They had been Sarah, and she's saying, you know, if God had told me to kill my only child, I would have said, I'm going to. Because that would be, first of all, it goes against the feminine instinct, which is to protect life. And secondly, it's really putting the promise in jeopardy. I mean, this man, of course, we know the end of the story, but he didn't know how it was going to end. Nevertheless, later, in the book of Hebrews, he is highlighted, and her efforts to actually preserve life are never mentioned, right? So how?
Boy, there's several things there. I mean, on the one hand, the very fact that he doesn't know is the whole point of the passage. So So that's another kind of issue. I mean, that's the thing of faith, that he actually puts it in jeopardy. And what you find, even if it doesn't make any sense to us in the narrative, that's the whole point. And if you look at the narrative and follow, if I had a whiteboard I can show you, but the issue of the seed. So when you have in the Old Testament narratives of Genesis, is the development of the seed. What you have is the human seed that grows, and you see this in the genealogies of Abraham, of Abram, and Noah. You see this going out this way. But within the larger human seed, you also see the particular seed, which is the seed of the chosen people. And within that seed, Genesis 49, is the seed of Judah. So what you find is this issue of the seed, crucial throughout the whole narrative. And what you also find is that there's always obstacles to the seed. There's barrenness. These women are barren. There's warfare. There's famine. See? So what you find then is obstacles to the seed Sometimes there are physical obstacles of death, of dying, of hunger. You also find obstacles of faith, you see, where, for instance, Lot's daughters, for seed, they get their father drunk, end of chapter 19, and they have children from their drunken father. So what you're seeing throughout the narrative is this whole theme of the seed and how it's related in the women and the men about faith. They must have faith to have seed. And Sarai, at one point, she has no faith. Take my servant. Take my servant and have a child with her, Hagar. She fails the test, as does Abram. So what you have is they're both growing in faith. They're both having to face the obstacles of their faith. You see, so I find Sarah, an incredibly resilient woman, but she has her low points too, and her lack of faith in moments too, and that's just being human. I mean, when my wife and I wanted to have children, she couldn't. So you go to a doctor. There is something that as the woman, she wanted children. So it's all very human. And in her case, she turns to her maidservant. I mean, that's just life. But you see the matriarchs, so I can call them that, they're all facing their own difficulties, right? And then, Jacob and Esau, the mother takes sides and helps one. You see, so you're getting this kind of very human dynamic of both genders in the text. Now, does Abraham become the hero in Hebrews? Okay. But the genitive narrative is much more complex. I'm not going to limit myself to the book of Hebrews. Just taking one particular strand, but there's so much more than what Hebrews. And that gets back to your question, see? If all I care about in the Old Testament is what the New Testament says about it, I eliminate huge parts of the Old Testament. You see? So I would say yes in Hebrews. Okay, but there's much more than that. That's how I would respond. Our time's up. It's like 5 to 12. Yeah.